Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are talking about one of the most incredible features of our planet, the mind-boggling variety of life that we call biodiversity.
So let's just jump right in with a little thought experiment. Picture this. An alien visitor lands on Earth for the very first time. What's the one thing that would totally blow their mind? It's probably not our skyscrapers or our smartphones.
Nope, it would be this. The sheer, almost unbelievable variety of living things. I mean, we're talking about more than 300,000 species of beetles alone, something like 28,000 species of fish, and almost 20,000 different kinds of orchids. The scale is just staggering, and it makes you ask, well, what does it all mean? So how do we wrap our heads around all this variety? Well, scientists have a word for it, biodiversity. But what are we really talking about when we use that term? The term itself was made famous by the sociobiologist Edward Wilson. And here's the key thing to get. It's not just about counting up all the different animals and plants. It's way deeper. It's about the combined diversity at all the different levels of life, from the tiniest genes to the entire planet. And that's what's so cool about it. Biodiversity isn't just one flat idea. You can think of it like three different layers, all stacked on top of each other and all connected. And to really get it, you've got to understand each of these layers. And these are the big three. You've got genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecological diversity. So let's quickly break down what each one of those actually is. Okay, first up is genetic diversity. This is all the variety you find within a single species. I mean, just think about this. In India, there are more than 50,000 different genetic strains of rice and over 1,000 different kinds of mangoes. That's all the same species, but with incredible variety baked into their DNA, which is what helps them adapt and survive. Next, we've got the one we're probably all most familiar with, species diversity. This one's pretty simple. It's just the number of different species you find in one place. A great example is in India's Western Ghats Mountains, which have way more different kinds of amphibian species than you'd find in the Eastern Ghats. And finally, we zoom all the way out to ecological diversity. Now we're talking about the variety of entire ecosystems. You look at a country like India, and you've got deserts, rainforests, wetlands, coral reefs, the whole shebang. Now compare that to a country like Norway, which, while beautiful, just has a lot less variety in its ecosystems. So here's the bottom line. This incredible richness of life, something that took millions and millions of years of evolution to build, it's not just some nice to have. It's become a critical environmental issue. Figuring out how to protect it is now a massive international concern for the health of our planet. And that brings us to a pretty massive question, right? If we're supposed to be protecting all this biodiversity, we should probably know how much of it there is. So how many species are actually out there on Earth? Well, if you look at the official scorecard, the number is pretty impressive. According to the IUCN back in 2004, we have officially named and described just over 1.5 million species of plants and animals. That sounds like a ton, but it's really just what we've managed to catalog so far. And that's where the real mystery begins. Because for every species we've put a name to, how many more are out there, totally unknown to science? What we know is really just the tip of the iceberg. You know, some wild estimates have been thrown around. Some people say up to 50 million. But a much more scientifically respected estimate from a biologist named Robert May puts the real number somewhere around 7 million. Think about that. For every one species we know, there might be 3 or 4 more that we've never even seen. So why don't we just go out and count them? Well, it's not that simple. For one, a huge number of these undiscovered species are hiding out in the tropics, which are incredibly complex. And then you've got the microscopic world of bacteria and other microbes. Our usual ways of identifying species just don't work for them, especially since you can't even grow most of them in a lab. Okay, so let's take that 1.5 million known species and break it down a bit. When you start to unpack the numbers and see how it's all distributed, some really wild patterns start to show up. Right off the bat, one thing just leaps out at you. Of all the life we've ever recorded, animals are the undisputed champions. Over 70% of all known species are animals. Plants make up a pretty small slice in comparison, only about 22%. But here's where it gets truly crazy. If you zoom in on just that huge animal kingdom slice, you find that one group completely dominates everything else. Insects. They make up more than 70% of all animals. It's not even close. Let me put that another way. Think of any 10 animals on Earth. Statistically, 7 of them are insects.
It's their world, really. We're just living in it. And it's not just insects. Here's another fact that'll bend your brain. The number of fungi species in the world is greater than all the fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals combined. It just goes to show you the most visible life isn't always the most common. So that's the big global picture. But to really see what this means, let's zoom in on a specific place, one of the world's 12 mega-diversity countries, to see how it plays out on the ground. And what a place to zoom in on. Check this out. India has only 2.4% of the world's total land area, but it's home to a whopping 8.1% of all the species on the planet. It punches way, way above its weight when it comes to biological wealth. The numbers are just mind-boggling. So far, scientists have recorded around 45,000 types of plants and about double that many animals. But here's the thing. If we apply those global estimates from Robert May, there are probably more than 100,000 plant species and over 300,000 animal species in India that we haven't even found yet. The job of just cataloging it all is nowhere near finished. And that really brings us to a final, pretty urgent thought. We're in a race against time here. All of this amazing, undiscovered life is under threat. We're facing the very real possibility of losing countless species before we even know they exist. It's like a massive library is on fire, and we haven't even had the chance to read the titles on the books. What incredible things are we losing before we even have a chance to find them? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're decoding two fundamental patterns that shape pretty much all life on Earth. We're going to reveal the hidden rules that govern where species live and, where they thrive. Okay, let's dive right in. And that brings up the central mystery, right? All this incredible biological richness isn't just random chaos. There's a hidden order to it, a set of patterns that ecologists have been trying to figure out for centuries. And today, we're going to look at two of the biggest ones. All right, so let's get into the first major clue. It's actually one of the most well-known patterns in all of ecology, and it's tied directly to the geography of our planet. It's called the latitudinal gradient. And really, it's pretty simple. As a general rule, the closer you get to the equator, the more different kinds of species you're going to find. Then, as you travel north or south towards the poles, that species count starts to drop off, and sometimes it drops off dramatically. Let's make this feel a little more real. We're going to take a quick trip, just following bird species. We'll start in the tropics, in a country like Colombia, which is right there on the equator. So, take a guess. How many species of birds do you think live there? Get this, an incredible 1,400 species. I mean, just pause and think about that. That is a massive concentration of bird life, all packed into one country. Okay, now let's travel north with our imaginations. We're leaving the tropics and heading to a temperate region like New York, which sits at about 41 degrees north latitude. The environment totally changes and, well, so does the species count. It just plummets. We're down to only 105. That's a drop of over 90%. I mean, that is a huge, huge difference. But we're not done yet. Let's keep going. We're going to head all the way up to Greenland at 71 degrees north, way up inside the Arctic Circle. And the number drops again, down to just 56 species. This just perfectly shows the gradient, right? We went from 1,400 near the equator to 105 in the temperate zone, all the way down to just 56 at the pole. Wow. And look, this isn't just some weird thing that only happens with birds. Not at all. The exact same rule applies to plants. A tropical forest in Ecuador can have 10 times more plant species than a forest of the exact same size in the American Midwest. It's just a fundamental rule of life on our planet. So, naturally, this brings up the big question. Why? I mean, what is so special about the tropics? Well, ecologists have been working on this, and they have a few key ideas. Okay, so there are three main theories on the table. First up, evolutionary time. Unlike places that went through big ice ages, the tropics have been pretty stable for millions of years. This gave evolution a long, uninterrupted runway for all sorts of new species to pop up. Second, the climate is way more constant. There's less crazy seasonal change, so the environment is more predictable. This lets species get super specialized, and they can coexist without competing so much. And third, it's just about pure energy. The tropics get hit with more direct sunlight, which means more plants, which means a bigger base for the entire food web. It can just support more life. So that was our first global rule. Now let's zoom in a bit and look at our second major pattern. This one shifts our focus from the whole globe down to a more regional level.
It's all about the relationship between how big an area is and how many species you can find there. And this whole idea really got its start with the legendary German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt. While he was on these incredible explorations in South America, he noticed something really profound. The more ground he covered, the more species he found. But the rate of finding new species eventually started to slow down. Now, if you plot this relationship on a normal graph, you get this curve. But here's where scientists get clever. If you change the scale of the graph to be logarithmic, where, say, the space between 10 and 100 is the same as the space between 100 and 1,000, that curve magically turns into a perfect straight line. And straight lines are way, way easier to describe with a simple equation. And that straight line gives us this tidy little equation. Now, don't get scared off for the math here, I promise. The only letter you really need to care about is z. Z represents the slope of that line. Just think of it as a number that tells us exactly how quickly we find new species as we explore a bigger and bigger area. So, what's the big deal about this z value? Why do we care how steep the line is? Well, that's where the real secret is hiding. The steepness of that line tells you something really important about the ecosystem you're looking at. What's so fascinating is that for most regions, doesn't matter if you're looking at plants in Britain or birds in California, that z value is weirdly consistent. It's almost always somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2. But something wild happens when you zoom way out. If you analyze a massive area, like a whole continent, that line gets way steeper, and the z values jump up to between 0.6 and 1.2. So why the huge difference? And just to give you a concrete example, when scientists looked at fruit-eating birds and mammals across all the tropical forests on different continents, they found the slope, that z value, was a very steep 1.15. So what does the steeper slope actually mean in plain English? It means that when you're looking at a huge continent-sized area, adding just a little bit more land gives you a massive number of new species. The diversity just explodes much more rapidly at these bigger scales than it does when you're looking at a smaller local region. So there you have it, 2 of the planet's hidden rules for biodiversity. The latitudinal gradient tells us where to find the most species. Get yourself near the equator. And the species-area relationship tells us that the bigger the area, the more species it's going to hold. And that relationship actually changes depending on the scale you're looking at. You know, these elegant patterns are the result of millions and millions of years of evolution, creating this rich, complex, and beautifully ordered biological world we live in. And this leaves us with a final and pretty critical question. What happens when our own activities start to rapidly break up habitats, shattering these fundamental rules in less than a single century? Have you ever stopped to think about just how much life there is on Earth? I mean, hundreds of thousands of species of beetles, but only one species of us. It's wild. And for decades, ecologists have been wrestling with a huge question. Does all this variety actually matter? So today, we're going to dig into why having a ton of different species isn't just nice to look at. It's absolutely critical to the health of our entire planet. All right, here's the game plan. We'll start with that old idea. Do more species really mean more stability? Then we'll get clear on what stable even means in biology. From there, we'll look at some incredible real-world evidence, break it all down with a fantastic analogy called the rivet-popper hypothesis, and then we'll bring it all home to see why every single one of those species is so important. So let's jump right in with that big foundational question. It's something scientists have been debating for a long time. What's the actual value of having so many different kinds of life all packed together? I mean, it kind of seems obvious, right? More variety has to be a good thing. But, science can't run on gut feelings. Ecologists had to know for sure. If you've got one forest with 100 species and another with 1,000, does that massive difference actually change how the whole system works? And for ages, the general thinking was, yep, it does. It was just sort of accepted wisdom that the more species you have, the more stable the community is. A diverse ecosystem was a tough, resilient one. But to actually prove that, you first have to agree on what you mean by stable. And that leads us to the next crucial step. Before you can go out and measure something like stability, you gotta define it. So what exactly makes a biological community stable? Well, scientists pin it down to 3 key things. First, its productivity, the amount of life it's churning out, doesn't go on a wild roller coaster ride from year to year. Second, it can take a punch. It can either resist disturbances like a drought or a fire, or it can bounce back really fast.
And third, it's strong enough to keep invasive alien species from taking over. Okay, so now we have a clear definition. The next move? Test it in the real world. And this is where the incredible work of ecologist David Tillman comes into play. Tillman didn't just sit around and theorize. Nope, he got his hands dirty. He set up these long-term experiments using outdoor plots of land. He could actually control how many species were in each plot, and then he just watched. For years, this was a total game changer for ecological research. So what did he find? The results were fascinating. The plots with more species, they had way less variation in their biomass year after year. Check one for stability. He also found that more diversity actually led to higher productivity overall. This was some of the first hard experimental proof that yes, the number of species really, really matters. But let's be real, scientific data can feel a bit abstract. To make a concept like this really click, you need a powerful analogy. And that brings us to the absolutely brilliant rivet popper hypothesis. This idea comes from a Stanford ecologist named Paul Ehrlich. He wanted a way to explain the danger of losing species that anyone could get, not just fellow scientists. So he compared an entire ecosystem to an airplane. Here's how it works. The airplane itself is the ecosystem. All the different species in it, those are the thousands of rivets holding the plane together. So when a species goes extinct, it's like someone is popping a rivet out of the plane. And here's the key part. Some of those rivets, the ones on the wings, are way more important than others. Those represent key species. Early pointed out, but if you just pop one little rivet, the plane is probably going to be fine. But what happens when you pop another? And another? He said that as more and more rivets are removed, the plane becomes dangerously weak over a period of time. It's that slow, creeping danger of biodiversity loss. Think about it like this. If you lose a rivet from a passenger seat, maybe some obscure insect, you probably won't even notice. The flight goes on. But what happens if you lose a rivet from the wing? That's a key species, like a major pollinator or a top predator. Losing that could mean catastrophic, immediate failure. And the scary part is, we don't always know which species are the wing rivets until they're gone. So what does this all mean for us right now? Well, this whole analogy isn't just a clever story. It's about our role and our future on this planet. The science from the field and this powerful analogy all point to the exact same unavoidable conclusion. Rich biodiversity isn't a luxury. It's not just nice to have. It's a fundamental requirement for our own survival. We rely on these stable, complex systems for literally everything: the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat. And that leaves us with one final, pretty chilling thought. In Ehrlich's analogy, we're the passengers on the plane, and we're the ones popping the rivets. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, which species will be the last one? Which rivet will be the one that's one too many? It's a question we really can't afford to find out the hard way. Okay, let's get right into it. We're going to take a hard look at something happening all around us right now, the staggering rate at which life on our planet is disappearing. So here's our game plan. We'll start with just how amazing Earth's biological wealth is. Then we'll get into the tough stuff, how it's all disappearing. We'll look at the incredible speed of this crisis, unmask the four main culprits, and then tackle the biggest question of all. Why should you even care? All right, first up, let's try to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of life we're talking about. I mean, it took billions of years of evolution to create this living library of species. It's a wealth we just sort of inherited. The numbers are they're almost silly. When we say biodiversity, we're not talking about a handful of different animals. We live in a world with over 20,000 different kinds of ants, more than 300,000 species of beetles, and something like 20,000 different species of orchids. That is the biological treasure we're dealing with. But here's the thing. While that biological wealth is immense, our planetary bank account is being emptied out fast. This is the great disappearance. And unfortunately, we've been keeping a tally of the losses. If you look at the records from the IUCN Red List, the last 500 years have been brutal. Hundreds of species have just vanished. You probably know some of the famous ones: the dodo, gone forever in the 1600s; the Steller sea cow, which was wiped out just 27 years after Westerners first laid eyes on it; the quagga, a really unique type of zebra; and the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger. The last one died in a zoo back in 1936. But this isn't just history. The threat today is massive.
And it's hitting some groups harder than others. Right now, nearly a third of all amphibian species are staring down the barrel of extinction. It's almost the same for gymnosperms, those ancient plants like conifers. And for mammals, our own relatives, a shocking 23% are at risk. So, you see, these aren't just one-off tragedies. They're all symptoms of a much bigger problem. Scientists are calling it the sixth mass extinction. And the thing that makes this one so terrifying is its speed. It's completely unnatural. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, wait a minute, haven't mass extinctions happened before? And yeah, you're absolutely right. The fossil record clearly shows 5 other times in Earth's history when life was nearly wiped out. But this one, the one happening right now, is a completely different beast. So what makes it so different? It really comes down to one thing. Those past 5 extinctions were caused by nature. Giant asteroids, supervolcanoes, stuff that played out over millions of years. This 6th extinction, it's being caused by one species, us. Human activity is the engine here, and the rate of loss is just off the charts. And here it is. This is probably the most important number to understand. Scientists estimate that species are going extinct today somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times faster than the natural rate, before we came along. Just let that sink in for a moment. This isn't a slow, natural cycle. This is a system in freefall. Okay, so if we're the cause, what are we actually doing that's so destructive? Well, ecologists have identified 4 main drivers of this crisis, and they've given them a pretty ominous name, the evil quartet. So here are the 4 horsemen of the biodiversity apocalypse. First, and by far the biggest, is habitat loss. Next up is over-exploitation, which is basically us just taking too much too fast. Then you have alien species invasions, throwing whole ecosystems out of whack. And finally, there's the quiet domino effect of co-extinctions. Let's start with the big one. Habitat loss is, hands down, the #1 reason species are disappearing. And there's no better example than the tropical rainforests. Places like the Amazon, people call them the lungs of our planet for a reason. They used to cover more than 14% of the Earth's land surface. Today, it's less than 6%. We're clearing them for farming, for cattle ranching, at a rate that's just impossible to believe. Every single minute, huge areas are just gone. And it's simple, right? When you destroy an animal's home, it has nowhere else to go. The other 3 are just as devastating. You've got over-exploitation. That's how we lost the Steller sea cow. Humans just couldn't stop hunting them. Then you have alien invasions. A new species gets introduced and just wreaks havoc. A prime example is the Nile perch in Africa's Lake Victoria. Its introduction led to the extinction of more than 200 native fish species. 200! And then there's co-extinction. This one's stealthy. One species disappears, and another species that relied on it, well, it's doomed too. Like a flower that loses its one and only pollinator. And that brings us to the most important question in all of this. We know what's happening. We know why it's happening. But so what? Does it really matter if we lose a few thousand species? I mean, it's a legitimate question. It feels kind of abstract. Does my life actually change if a certain species of tree frog in a jungle halfway around the world disappears? To really understand the answer, we need a good analogy. And honestly, the best one I've ever heard comes from a Stanford ecologist named Paul Ehrlich. He calls it the rivet popper hypothesis, and it makes everything crystal clear. Okay, picture an airplane. That airplane is an ecosystem. All the parts of the plane are held together by thousands and thousands of tiny rivets. Each one of those rivets is a species. Now imagine you're on a flight and every passenger decides to pop out just one rivet to take home as a souvenir. Losing one rivet? Probably no big deal. The plane will still fly. Maybe you could even lose a few dozen. But at what point does the plane become unsafe? At what point do you pop the one rivet that causes the whole thing to fall apart? And what if you don't just pop a rivet from a seat cushion, but from the wing? That's what ecologists call a keystone species. Losing that one could cause immediate catastrophic failure. That's what we're doing to our planet. We are popping rivets one by one with no idea which one is the one that holds the wing on. And maybe that's the greatest tragedy of all. We're losing life so fast, countless species will be gone before we even know they existed. It's like we're standing by watching a massive library burn to the ground, and we haven't even had a chance to read the titles of the books inside. The only real question left is, what are we going to do before the last book turns to ash? All right, let's dive right in.
Today, we are talking about one of the most fundamental and honestly, one of the most mind-boggling features of our world, biodiversity. We're going to explore the sheer variety of life on Earth, figure out why it's so critical for our own survival, and look at what on earth we're doing to protect it.
I mean, think about that for a second. The sheer variety of life on this planet is kind of hard to wrap your head around, right? So to give you just a taste of what we're talking about, let's fire off a few numbers. You see them all the time, right? Ants. But have you ever stopped to wonder how many types of ants there actually are? Well, the answer is a whopping 20,000 known species. And believe me, we're just getting started. Okay, so 20,000 is a lot. But beetles? They just blow that number completely out of the water. Get this, 300,000 different species. And it's not just on land. Let's head underwater. You've got almost 28,000 species of fish. Now, you've got all this incredible, mind-blowing variety, millions of years in the making. But here's the thing. It's in trouble. Big trouble. This quote just hits so hard, doesn't it? We're losing these species faster than we can even find and name them. It's like a massive library is on fire, and we're losing the books before we've even had a chance to read the titles. And this isn't just sad, for the animals. It's a huge, direct threat to us. So, okay, it's amazing, but why should we really, truly care? Like, on a practical level? Well, it turns out there are some really solid reasons, and they basically fall into three main buckets. First, you've got the direct economic benefits, the actual stuff nature gives us. Second, there are the life support services, all the crucial things ecosystems do for us. And third, well, there's just our ethical duty. Let's break them down. Okay, let's start with the most straightforward one, the stuff we can literally take, use, and sell. I'm talking about the direct economic gifts that nature just hands over to us. And this is a huge deal. It's our food, cereals, fruits, you name it. It's firewood for fuel. It's industrial products like resins and dyes. But here's a real mind blower: medicines. More than a quarter of all the drugs on the market come directly from plants. Just think about that. What potential cures are we losing before we even find them? All right, moving on to the second big reason. This one's a bit broader. It's about all the stuff nature does for us in the background. The things we totally take for granted, but literally couldn't live without. These are the planet's life support systems. I mean, seriously, how do you put a price tag on the air we breathe? The Amazon rainforest alone churns out about 20% of the Earth's oxygen. What's the dollar value on that? Or think about bees and birds pollinating our crops. Without them, poof, there goes a huge chunk of our food supply. You can't buy these services. They are absolutely priceless. And that brings us to the third argument, which is, well, it's about doing the right thing. It's the ethical case. It says that every single species has value in and of itself, It has a right to exist, whether we can make money off it or not. We share this planet, and we kind of owe it to future generations not to leave behind a mess. Okay, so we've covered the why. Now for the how. How do we actually do this conservation thing? Well, the first big approach is what's called in situ conservation. It's a fancy term for a really simple idea. You protect species right where they live, on site. You save their entire home. And one of the smartest ways to do that is to focus on something called biodiversity hotspots. Now, for a place to get this label, it's got to check two very important boxes. First, it has to be absolutely teeming with life, just a ton of different species. And second, it needs to have a lot of what's called endemism. That just means it has species you won't find anywhere else on the planet. They're unique to that one spot. So how many of these supercritical places are there? You might think there'd be hundreds, right? Nope. Globally, we've identified just 34. 34. That's a shockingly small number, which makes protecting every single one of them unbelievably important. And here's why this is such a game changer. All these hotspots combined, they cover less than 2% of the Earth's land. But, and this is the amazing part, they're so packed with unique life that if we can just protect them, we could slash the current mass extinction rate by nearly 30%. Talk about getting a lot of bang for your buck. And you can see this strategy playing out for real. Take India, for example. They're protecting 3 of these global hotspots, the Western Ghats, Indo-Burma, and the Himalayas.
On top of that, they've got 14 biosphere reserves, 90 national parks, almost 450 wildlife sanctuaries, and even sacred groves that have been protected for cultural reasons for ages. It's a huge layered approach. But what if a species is right on the brink of extinction, so endangered that just protecting its home isn't going to cut it? Well, that's when we turn to Plan B. It's called ex situ conservation. Think of it like an emergency room for endangered species, taking them off-site to save them.
So just to be clear on the difference, in situ is on-site, in the wild. Ex situ is off-site. This is where you get things like zoological parks and botanical gardens, but it also includes some really high-tech approaches, like cryopreservation, which is basically freezing genetic material and creating seed banks to save plant species for the long, long haul. It's a crucial safety net. Now, here's the thing. Nature doesn't care about our maps, right? A migratory bird doesn't need a passport to cross a border, and that means protecting all this life can't just be one country's job. It has to be a global team effort. Period. And the good news is, we have been taking some major steps. Back in 1992, you had the big Earth Summit in Rio. That was a huge deal. It really put conservation on the global map. Then, 10 years later in Johannesburg, things got even more serious. 190 countries actually pledged to put the brakes on biodiversity loss. These agreements are basically the bedrock of our global conservation efforts today. So to bring this all home, I want to leave you with this powerful analogy from an ecologist named Paul Ehrlich. He said to think of an ecosystem as an airplane, and every single species is a rivet holding that plane together. Now, if passengers start popping out those rivets to take home as souvenirs, one or two might not seem to matter. The plane still flies. But you keep popping those rivets, and eventually that whole plane is going to get real weak real fast. And here's the final and maybe the most chilling part of that idea. It really, really matters which rivet you take. Popping a rivet from a seat cushion? Maybe not a big deal. Popping a rivet from the wing? That's a whole different story. So as we watch species vanish, we have to ask ourselves a pretty terrifying question. Which one is the rivet that's holding our wing on?